The great archive building stood at the center of Zephyr Prime like a monument to 3,000 years of conquest. Its walls held the history of every civilization the Zephyrini Empire had ever encountered. Most of those civilizations no longer existed as independent entities. They had been absorbed into the Empire through force or the threat of it. The Zephyrini were proud of their record, and they saw no reason why it should ever change. Commander Vexler walked through the dusty corridors of the archive with purpose. He was young for a commander and ambitious beyond measure. The High Command had tasked him with finding new worlds to bring into the Empire, and he intended to exceed their expectations. His boots echoed against the stone floor as he made his way deeper into the oldest section of the building where few visitors ever ventured. The archive keeper was an elderly Zephyrini named Mortek, who had spent his entire life among these records. He looked up from his work terminal as Vexler approached, and his expression suggested he was not pleased by the interruption. Young commanders rarely understood the value of old knowledge, and they usually wanted answers immediately without proper research. Vexler explained what he needed. He wanted information about unexplored or underutilized sectors of space that might contain worlds suitable for conquest. Mortek sighed and led him to a section of the archive that had not been accessed in centuries. The data crystals here were ancient, and their information had never been transferred to modern systems, because nobody thought it was important enough. For hours, Vexler reviewed records of long-dead civilizations and abandoned survey missions. Most of the information was useless, but then he found something interesting. A survey report from nearly 2,000 years ago mentioned a sector of space that had been marked as restricted. The report was brief and gave no detailed explanation for the restriction. It simply noted that the sector contained several primitive civilizations, including one on a planet called Earth. Vexler requested all files related to this restricted sector. Mortek brought him a single data crystal that was so old it required a special reader to access. The crystal contained only one entry about the species from Earth. The entry had been written by an elder named Keshver, who had been part of an exploration mission long before the Empire had reached its current size. The entry was frustratingly short. It described humans as bipedal mammals with basic tool-using capabilities and tribal social structures. Their technology at the time of observation was primitive to the point of being irrelevant. They had barely discovered agriculture and showed no signs of being capable of space travel. But at the end of the entry was a warning that seemed completely disconnected from the description that preceded it. The warning read in simple terms that shocked Vexler with its directness. Stay away from humans. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Do not underestimate. The entry provided no explanation for this warning and no context for why such a primitive species would warrant such caution. It was signed by Elder Keshver and marked with the highest level of advisory importance. Vexler found the warning absurd. He pulled up current intelligence data on the sector and found that humans had indeed developed space travel in the centuries since that ancient survey. They had spread to several planets and moons in their home system and had recently achieved faster-than-light capability. Their technology was still generations behind Zephyrini standards, but they were no longer the primitive tribes described in the old report. The commander spent the next several days researching everything he could find about humans and their current capabilities. Their ships were crude but functional. Their weapons relied on kinetic projectiles and basic energy systems that would be ineffective against Zephyrini shields. Their military was organized but small and had never faced a truly advanced opponent. By every metric that mattered, humans appeared to be exactly the kind of target the Empire specialized in conquering. Vexler brought his findings to the High Command Council. He presented detailed analysis of human technology and strategic assessments of their military capabilities. He pointed out that Earth occupied a strategically valuable position near several resource-rich systems that the Empire could exploit. The potential benefits of bringing humans under Zephyrini control were significant. Then he mentioned the ancient warning, and the council chamber fell silent. The elder council members exchanged glances that Vexler could not quite interpret. Finally, one of them spoke and asked to see the original entry. The data crystal was brought before the council and they reviewed it carefully. Council member Threshcore argued that the warning was clearly outdated. It had been written when humans were barely sentient by galactic standards, and whatever danger Elder Keshver had perceived were surely no longer relevant. The humans of today were more advanced, but still far inferior to the Zephyrini in every way that mattered for warfare, but the oldest member of the council was Elder Kirishan, who had served for over 200 years. She spoke rarely, but when she did, the other council members listened. She reminded them that Elder Keshver had been one of the most respected explorers in Zephyrini history. He had surveyed hundreds of worlds and encountered countless species. He had never issued a warning like this about any other civilization. Kirishan argued that they should respect the wisdom of their ancestors even when they did not fully understand it. She proposed that the restricted status of human space should remain in effect until they had more information about why the warning had been issued in the first place. She suggested sending a small observation team to study humans more carefully before making any decisions about contact. Vexther countered that such caution was unnecessary and wasteful. He had already gathered extensive intelligence on human capabilities, and there was nothing in the data that suggested any real threat. The warning was 2,000 years old and based on observations of primitives who barely knew how to farm. Modern humans were more advanced, but still centuries behind the Empire in technology and military doctrine. The debate continued for hours. Younger council members sided with Vexler and saw an opportunity to expand the Empire and prove their worth. Older members urged caution and respect for ancient wisdom. Finally, a vote was called, and the result was close but decisive. The council approved a standard intimidation mission to Earth. The plan was simple and had been used successfully on dozens of other worlds. A fleet would arrive in human space and demonstrate overwhelming superiority. Demands for surrender would be issued with a time limit for compliance. Most species surrendered immediately when faced with such a show of force. Those who resisted initially almost always surrendered after the first demonstration of Zephyrini weapons. The few who continued to resist were crushed quickly and completely. Vexther was given command of the mission and authorization to assemble a fleet of 30 warships. It was more firepower than had been needed for any conquest in recent memory, but the council wanted to ensure there would be no possibility of failure. The fleet would arrive and make an impression that humans could not ignore or resist. Elder Kirishan made one final attempt to change the council's mind. She stood before them and spoke with a gravity that made even the youngest members pause. She reminded them that their ancestors had left them one warning about humans and only one. In 3,000 years of expansion across hundreds of worlds, they had never been told to avoid any other species. That fact alone should give them reason to reconsider, but the vote had been taken and the decision was made. The council thanked Kirishan for her counsel, but insisted that the mission would proceed as planned. Vexther left the chamber to begin preparations, and he felt certain that he was about to add another easy victory to the Empire's long list of conquests. The fleet assembled over the following weeks. 30 of the finest warships in the Zephyrini military gathered at the staging point. Their crews were experienced and confident. They had heard stories about the ancient warning but dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. They were warriors of the greatest empire in the galaxy, and they had never met an enemy they could not defeat. As the fleet prepared to depart, Vexler stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked out at the assembled vessels. He felt pride and anticipation. This mission would prove his worth to the High Command and establish his reputation as a capable leader. The humans would surrender quickly, and the restricted sector would be opened for exploitation. It would all be very simple and very profitable. The fleet entered hyperspace and began the journey to Earth. None of them knew that they were about to learn why Elder Keshver had left his warning. None of them understood that some lessons can only be learned through pain, and that the price of ignoring wisdom is sometimes higher than anyone can imagine. The Zephyrini fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system with perfect precision. 30 warships emerged from the void in tight formation, and their sensors immediately began scanning everything within range. What they found was more extensive than Vexter had expected, but not more impressive. Humans had indeed spread throughout their star system, with settlements on multiple planets, and moons and orbital stations scattered in various locations. Vexter studied the tactical display from his command chair and felt satisfied with what he saw. Human ships were moving about their business without any apparent awareness of the threat that had just arrived. Their sensor technology was clearly inferior if they had not detected the fleet's arrival yet. It took nearly 10 minutes before the human vessels began to change course and move into defensive positions. The commander ordered his communications officer to broadcast the standard surrender demand on all frequencies that humans were known to use. The message was simple and direct. The Zephyrini Empire had come to bring order to this system. Humanity would surrender all military assets immediately and accept imperial governance. They had 72 hours to comply or face the consequences of resistance. The message was repeated in every human language that Zephyrini intelligence had on file. On Earth, the response to the alien arrival was controlled chaos. President John Callahan had been in a budget meeting when his security chief burst into the room with the news. An alien fleet had appeared at the edge of the solar system and was demanding unconditional surrender. The president ordered an immediate emergency session with his top military commanders and every available expert on potential first contact scenarios. Admiral Patricia Hayes was already on her way to the command center when the summons came. She had spent 20 years in the Earth Defense Fleet and had participated in countless training exercises for exactly this type of situation. The reality was more terrifying than any simulation, but her training held firm. She arrived at the command center and immediately began organizing defensive positions for every available ship. General Kyle Murphy commanded the ground forces, and his concern was different from the admiral's. If those alien ships made it past the orbital defenses, then his troops would be facing an enemy with unknown capabilities and superior technology. He ordered all military installations to full alert and began coordinating with civilian authorities to prepare evacuation. Protocols for major population centers. The president's science advisor was Dr. Helen Price, who had degrees in physics and xenobiology. She listened to the alien message multiple times and analyzed every aspect of their transmission. The language translation was impressive and suggested that the Zephyrini had been observing humanity for some time. Their demand for surrender was not a negotiation but an ultimatum. They clearly expected compliance without question. Captain Derek Hansen received his orders while his ship, the Defiant, was on patrol near Mars. He was to approach the alien fleet under white flag protocols and attempt to establish direct communication. His mission was to buy time and gather intelligence while the defense forces organized. It was dangerous, but somebody had to make the first move, and Hansen had volunteered before the order was even given. The Defiant approached the Zephyrini fleet slowly, with all weapons powered down and broadcasting peaceful intentions on every channel. Hansen's crew was tense but professional. His science officer, Lieutenant Amy Rogers, kept her sensors focused on the alien ships and fed constant updates to both the captain and Earth Command. The energy signatures she was detecting were far beyond anything in the human arsenal. Vexter watched the small human ship approach and felt a mixture of amusement and respect. At least these humans had the courage to face him directly rather than hiding behind their primitive defenses. He granted permission for the human captain to establish a direct communication link. The face that appeared on his screen was weathered and determined. This Captain Hansen showed no obvious fear despite being completely outmatched. Hansen spoke carefully and chose his words with precision. He acknowledged that the Zephyrini possessed superior technology in greater numbers. He asked what terms might be available beyond unconditional surrender and whether there was room for negotiation. He suggested that humanity might be willing to discuss trade agreements or limited cooperation rather than complete Submission. The Zeffirni commanders. Response was exactly what Hansen expected, but still difficult to hear. There would be no negotiation and no alternative terms. Humanity would surrender completely or be forced to surrender through military action. To emphasize his point, Vexler had his weapons officer target a large uninhabited asteroid at the edge of the belt. A single shot from the flagship's main plasma cannon vaporized the entire asteroid in a brilliant flash of energy. Hansen maintained his composure despite the demonstration. He thanked the commander for the communication and said he would relay the message to his government. Vexler gave him a deadline reminder and terminated the connection. The human ship turned and began its journey back to Earth without incident. The commander felt certain that the demonstration had made the appropriate impact and that surrender would come. Quickly, on the Defiance bridge, Lieutenant Rogers was already compiling her analysis of what the sensors had captured during the exchange. The Zeffirni shields operated on a frequency that human weapons would have difficulty penetrating. Their plasma weapons were devastating but required significant charging time between shots. The ships themselves were heavily armored, but their formation suggested they relied more on technological superiority than tactical flexibility. It was not much, but it was something. Hansen delivered his report to Admiral Hayes and President Callahan in person. He described his interaction with the Zeffirni commander and shared the sensor data his crew had gathered. The footage of the asteroid's destruction was played for the entire Emergency Council, and the room fell silent as they watched the display of power. When the recording ended, everyone understood exactly what they were facing. President Callahan asked for options, and the room erupted in debate. Some advisors argued that surrender was the only logical choice. They could not win against such overwhelming force, and resistance would only lead to massive casualties. Others insisted that surrendering without a fight would doom humanity to permanent servitude under an alien empire. The argument went back and forth with no clear consensus. General Murphy broke the deadlock with a simple statement. His soldiers had taken an oath to defend Earth against all enemies, foreign and domestic. These aliens were about as foreign as enemies could get. He would not order his troops to surrender without firing a shot, and he doubted many of them would obey such an order even if he gave it. The warriors of Earth did not kneel to threats, no matter how powerful the enemy appeared. Admiral Hayes agreed with the general's assessment. Her fleet was outgunned but not helpless. They had advantages the aliens might not expect. Human ships were more maneuverable than the large Zeffirni vessels. Human crew members had trained extensively in damage control and emergency procedures. Most importantly, humans had something to fight. For while the aliens were just adding another conquest to their collection. Dr. Price pointed out that the Zeffirni had given them 72 hours, which suggested they wanted to avoid an actual battle if possible. The demand for surrender was meant to intimidate, and the demonstration of force was meant to break human will before any fighting began. If humanity could show that they would not break easily, then perhaps the aliens might reconsider the cost of conquest. President Callahan listened to all the arguments and then made his decision. He would address the planet and the colonies. He would explain the situation honestly and lay out the choice they faced. Then he would ask every human settlement to vote on how they should respond. This decision was too important to be made by one person or one government. It would affect every human alive and those yet to be born. The address was broadcast across Earth and to every human settlement in the solar system. The president spoke clearly and without exaggeration. An alien empire had arrived and demanded their surrender. The aliens possessed superior technology and greater numbers. Resistance would likely result in significant casualties and possibly defeat. But surrender would mean giving up everything humanity had built and accepting permanent subjugation under alien rule. The choice was theirs to make. The vote took only 12 hours to complete. The result was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. From the cities of Earth to the mining colonies on the asteroids to the research stations on the outer planets, the answer was the same. Humanity would not surrender. They would face this threat together, and they would fight for their freedom no matter the cost. If they were going to lose their independence, it would not be given away without resistance. Admiral Hayes received the authorization to begin military operations and immediately put her plans into action. Every available ship was recalled to defensive positions. Orbital weapons platforms were activated and armed. Ground forces began preparing defensive positions on Earth and the major colonies. The civilian population was informed of evacuation routes and emergency protocols. Humanity was going to war. Captain Hansen was given command of the forward reconnaissance group. His mission was to monitor the Zephyrni fleet and provide early warning if they began to advance. He accepted the assignment knowing that his ships would likely be the first to engage the enemy and the least likely to survive the encounter. His crew understood the risks and not a single person requested transfer. Vexter received humanity's response exactly 72 hours after his arrival. The message was brief and delivered by the same Captain Hansen who had approached him earlier. Humanity rejected the demand for surrender and request. Instead, that the Zephyrni fleet leave their space immediately. Any attempt to enforce the surrender demand would be met with military resistance. The message concluded with coordinates for the Zephyrni commander to meet human representatives for peaceful negotiations if he wished to reconsider his position. The commander stared at the message in disbelief. No species had ever rejected his surrender demand. None had offered him coordinates as though he was the one who needed to reconsider. The audacity was almost impressive, but it was also foolish beyond measure. These humans had seen a demonstration of Zephyrni power and they still chose to resist. Very well then. They would learn the price of defiance. Vexter ordered the fleet to advance toward Earth's orbital space. The time for warnings had passed, and now the time for action had arrived. His ships moved forward in perfect formation and their weapons began charging for combat. The humans wanted a fight, and the Zephyrni Empire would give them one. It would be brief and it would be decisive, and when it was over the survivors would understand why. Resistance was futile. The Zephyrni fleet entered Earth's orbital space with all the confidence of predators approaching cornered prey. Vexter had positioned his strongest ships at the front of the formation, while keeping his flagship in the center where he could coordinate the entire battle. His sensors showed dozens of human vessels moving into defensive positions around their orbital stations and planetary defenses. The tactical display made it clear that humanity was severely outmatched in every category that mattered. Admiral Hayes watched the enemy approach from her command center deep beneath the surface of Earth. Every screen showed different angles of the impending battle, and every report confirmed what she already knew. Her fleet was about to face an enemy they could not defeat through conventional means. But conventional warfare had never been humanity's only strength. She gave the order to engage and silently prayed that her people were ready for what was coming. The battle began, exactly as Vexter expected. His plasma cannons tore through human shields like they were made of paper. The first orbital station to fall was a military outpost that had been reinforced specifically to withstand attack. It lasted less than 3 minutes under concentrated Zephyrni fire before breaking apart in a cascade of explosions. 2 more stations followed within the next 10 minutes. Human return fire was ineffective against Zephyrni. Shields and their missiles were intercepted long before reaching their targets. Captain Hansen led his squadron in a desperate charge against the nearest Zephyrni cruiser. His weapons did minimal damage, but he was not trying to destroy the enemy ship. He was trying to draw fire away from the civilian evacuation transports that were fleeing from a nearby station. The Zephyrni took the bait, and 3 of their destroyers broke formation to pursue his squadron. Hansen's ships scattered in different directions and forced the enemy to split their attention. Lieutenant Rogers was monitoring sensor data when she noticed something unexpected. The Zephyrni shields fluctuated slightly whenever they fired their main weapons. The fluctuation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was there. She reported the finding to Hansen immediately, and he understood the implication. If they could time their attack to match that exact moment of weakness, they might actually penetrate the shields, but timing an attack that precisely while under fire and moving at combat speeds was nearly impossible. Hansen tried it anyway, and his first 2 attempts failed completely. His weapons hit the shield at full strength and dissipated harmlessly. On his third attempt he got lucky. His railgun round passed through during the fluctuation and struck the Zephyrini destroyer's hull directly. The damage was minor, but it proved the tactic could work. Admiral Hayes received the data from Hansen's engagement and immediately distributed it to every ship in the fleet. The orders were clear. Focus fire on enemy ships when they discharged their weapons. The timing would be difficult, but it was their only chance to inflict real damage. Human crews began coordinating their attacks and attempting to exploit the brief windows of vulnerability. Vexter noticed that human resistance was becoming more organized, but he was not concerned. They had destroyed 5 orbital stations and damaged countless human vessels. The battle was proceeding exactly according to plan. Then one of his cruisers reported significant hull damage from what should have been ineffective human weapons. The commander demanded an explanation, and his tactical officer showed him the sensor logs. The humans had discovered the shield fluctuation weakness. Vexter felt a flash of irritation, but still no real concern. Exploiting that weakness required precision that should be beyond human capabilities. Even if they managed to land a few hits, the damage would be minimal. He ordered his fleet to maintain formation and continue the advance. Earth's main defensive line was just ahead, and breaking it would effectively end the battle. Captain Lisa Morgan commanded the destroyer. Vigilant, and she had been waiting for an opportunity to make a difference. Her ship had taken heavy damage during the opening exchanges, and her engineering team reported that the main reactor was becoming unstable. She could try to make it back to Earth for repairs, or she could use her failing ship as a weapon. Morgan did not hesitate in making her choice. She ordered her crew to abandon ship and gave them exactly 2 minutes to reach the escape pods. Her executive officer refused to leave, but Morgan made it a direct order. When the last pod had launched, she turned the Vigilant toward the largest Zephyrini carrier she could find. The enemy ship was launching fighters, and its hangar bay was wide open. Morgan pushed her engines to maximum and aimed directly for that opening. The Zephyrini carrier's point defense systems opened fire, but Morgan flew through the incoming fire with skill born from years of combat training. Her ship took dozens of hits but kept flying. She reached the hangar bay and guided the Vigilant deep inside before triggering the reactor overload. The explosion tore the carrier apart from the inside, and the blast wave caught 3 nearby Zephyrini ships that had been flying in close formation. Vexler watched 4 of his ships disappear from the tactical display in a single massive explosion. The human destroyer had sacrificed itself deliberately and taken out more Zephyrini tonnage in one attack than the entire human fleet had managed in the previous hour. The commander felt something he had not experienced in a long time. It was the cold touch of doubt. The battle continued for hours, and the humans kept fighting with a desperation that bordered on madness. They used damaged ships as shields for undamaged ones. They deliberately rammed Zephyrini vessels when their weapons failed. They detonated their own reactors when capture seemed imminent. Every tactic they employed seemed designed to inflict maximum damage, regardless of the cost to themselves. General Murphy's ground forces on Mars got their chance to fight when a Zephyrini landing force attempted to establish a beachhead near the capital settlement. The alien troops had better armor and superior weapons, but they had never faced an enemy like humans. Murphy's soldiers used the terrain to their advantage and turned every building into a fortress. They rigged explosives in unexpected places and attacked from directions the Zephyrini did not anticipate. Commander Jake Phillips led a platoon in an ambush that caught a Zephyrini squad moving through a narrow canyon. His troops opened fire from elevated positions and used the rocky walls to shield themselves from return fire. When the aliens tried to advance, Phillips triggered demolition charges that brought tons of rock down on their position. 3 Zephyrini soldiers were captured when their position became cut off from their main force. The interrogation of the Zephyrini prisoners provided valuable intelligence, but it also revealed something troubling. The captured aliens were genuinely confused by human behavior. They could not understand why humans did not simply surrender when facing superior force. One of the prisoners asked Phillips directly why his people chose to die rather than accept what he called generous terms of servitude. Phillips' response was simple and delivered without anger or theatrics. He explained that humans had a concept called freedom that the Zephyrini apparently did not understand. Living under someone else's rule was not living at all. Every human would rather die fighting than spend their life kneeling. The Zephyrini prisoner seemed unable to comprehend this concept, and kept insisting that survival should be the primary concern. The space battle reached a critical point on the fourth day when Admiral Hayes committed her reserve forces to a concentrated assault on Vexler-S flagship. Every available human ship converged on the command vessel from multiple directions. The Zephyrini defensive formation held, but the pressure was intense. Human ships were being destroyed at an alarming rate, but they kept coming and each wave got closer to their target. Captain Derek Hansen's reconnaissance group had been reinforced with every damaged ship that could still fly. His mission had changed from observation to direct assault. He led his ships in a suicidal charge directly at the flagship's bridge section. Zephyrini point defense cut his formation to pieces, but 3 ships made it through, including the Defiant. Hansen's weapons officer fired everything they had left during the brief moment. When the flagship's shields fluctuated, the concentrated fire caused significant damage to the flagship's command system. Vexler-S main tactical display went dark and half of his communication channels failed. The humans had not destroyed his ship, but they had hurt it badly. More importantly, they had proven they could hurt it. The commander ordered his fleet to pull back to a safer distance. While damage control teams worked to restore functionality, the battle raged for 6 days total, and the casualties on both sides were staggering. The Zephyrini had lost 15 ships destroyed and 8 more severely damaged. Nearly half the fleet that had arrived so confidently was now gone or crippled. Human losses were far worse in absolute numbers. Millions had died on the orbital stations and thousands more in ship-to-ship combat. The Mars settlement had been heavily damaged and several smaller colonies had been evacuated completely, but the humans had not surrendered and they showed no signs of breaking. Every report Vexler received from his ship commanders told the same story. Human forces fought with a ferocity that defied logic. They adapted to Zephyrini tactics within hours of encountering them. They showed creativity in combat that the Zephyrini training manuals never addressed. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to have no fear of death. Vexler called a conference with his remaining ship commanders and the meeting was tense. His officers reported that crew morale was declining rapidly. The Zephyrini military had not suffered losses like this in generations. Several commanders openly questioned whether conquering Earth was worth the cost they were paying. One captain suggested that perhaps the ancient warning had been correct after all. The commander silenced the dissent and insisted that they would prevail. They still had numerical superiority and technological advantages. The humans were running low on ships and ammunition. One more major push would break their resistance. But even as Vexler gave these reassurances, he felt the doubt growing stronger. The humans had already lasted longer than any opponent he had ever faced. Admiral Hayes reviewed the battle reports and knew that Earth could not survive another major engagement. Her fleet was down to less than 30% of its original strength. Ammunition stocks were critically low and replacement parts were running out. But she also knew that the enemy was hurting badly. Intelligence reports suggested that Zephyrini morale was cracking and their formation discipline was weakening. The question was whether humanity could hold out long enough for that weakness to matter. President Callahan addressed the survivors and his message was broadcast to every remaining human settlement. He acknowledged the terrible losses they had suffered and honored those who had died defending their freedom. He told them honestly that the war was not over and more sacrifice would be required. But he also told them that the enemy was learning what it meant to fight humanity. Every ship they destroyed cost the aliens dearly. Every hour they held out proved that humans would never accept slavery. Vexler sat alone in his damaged command center and stared at the tactical display. The human defensive line was still intact, despite everything he had thrown at it. His fleet was battered and his crews were exhausted. Reinforcements were weeks away at best. For the first time in his military career, he was facing the possibility of failure. The ancient warning echoed in his memory, and he finally began to understand why it had been written. President Callahan knew that Earth could not win a war of attrition against an entire galactic empire. The Zephyrini fleet currently in their space was damaged and demoralized, but reinforcements would eventually arrive. When that happened, humanity would face an enemy that had learned from their mistakes and came prepared for human tactics. The only way to survive was to change the nature of the conflict entirely. Admiral Hayes proposed a strategy that was bold to the point of recklessness. Instead of waiting for the enemy to regroup and return stronger, humanity would take the fight directly to them. Intelligence Officer Commander Susan Blake had been analyzing every piece of data collected from the battle. She had identified patterns in Zephyrini supply movements and located their nearest support base on a colony world called HFY. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Earth would gather every combat-capable vessel that could be spared and launch a strike directly at the Zephyrini colony. The goal was not occupation or conquest but disruption. They would hit the enemy where they felt safe and prove that humanity could strike back. More importantly, they would send a message to the Zephyrini High Command that continuing this war would be costly beyond measure. General Murphy argued against the plan initially. Taking ships away from Earth's defense would leave the planet vulnerable if Vexler decided to launch another attack. But Admiral Hayes countered that their defensive fleet was already too weak to stop a determined assault. Their only real chance was to make the Zephyrini decide that Earth was not worth the cost of taking. Dr. Gregory Cole had been working around the clock at the Lunar Research Station since the war began. His team had recovered debris from destroyed Zephyrini ships, and they had been studying every component they could salvage. The breakthrough came when they analyzed the shield generator from a damaged destroyer. Cole discovered that Zephyrini shields operated on a harmonic frequency that could be disrupted. With the right modulation, the problem was that generating the required disruption field required enormous amounts of power. Human ships simply did not have reactors capable of producing that much energy while also maintaining weapons and life support. Cole's solution was radical. He proposed modifying human railguns to fire specially designed rounds that would carry their own power source. The rounds would be essentially one-shot shield breakers that would create a gap for conventional weapons to exploit, building enough of these special rounds to outfit an entire strike fleet would take weeks that humanity did not have. Cole's team worked without sleep and pulled resources from every available source. Manufacturing facilities that normally produce civilian goods were converted to military production. Scientists from universities and private corporations volunteered their expertise. The entire lunar colony rallied to support the effort. Captain Hansen was given command of the strike fleet, and the responsibility weighed heavily on him. His force would consist of 43 ships ranging from heavy cruisers to converted civilian vessels that had been hastily armed with whatever weapons could be mounted. Many of the crews were inexperienced in combat, and some of the ships was so badly damaged that it was a miracle they could fly at all. Lieutenant Amy Rogers had been promoted and assigned as Hansen's tactical officer. She spent days planning the attack route and identifying the best approach to Zephyr 7. The colony was not heavily defended because the Zephyrini had never needed to protect their rear areas from attack. Their empire had always been the aggressor, and their enemies had always been on the defensive. The strike fleet departed from Earth orbit with minimal ceremony. There was no time for grand speeches or formal send-offs. Every person involved understood the stakes and accepted the risks. Many of them did not expect to return, but they went anyway because someone had to take the fight to the enemy. Captain Hansen stood on the bridge of his flagship and felt the weight of command settle onto his shoulders. The journey to Zephyr 7 took 3 days, and the fleet used the time to drill and prepare. Crews practiced coordinating their fire and timing their attacks to exploit the shield disruptions that Cole's special rounds would create. The civilian ship crews trained alongside military veterans and learned quickly. Fear was present in everyone, but so was determination. Vexler remained at the edge of Earth's solar system with his damaged fleet and waited for reinforcements. His requests for additional ships had been approved, but it would take time for them to arrive. In the meantime, he established a blockade and tried to prevent human ships from leaving the system. His fleet was too weakened to launch another assault, but strong enough to contain the humans, or so he believed. The Zephyrni commander had no warning when Hansen's strike fleet emerged from hyperspace directly above Zephyr 7. The colony's defense satellites detected the human ships immediately, but there was no military fleet in position to intercept. The nearest Zephyrni warships were hours away at maximum speed. The colony was effectively defenseless against a determined attack. Hansen wasted no time on demands or warnings. His fleet opened fire on the orbital defense platforms with the new shield-breaking rounds, and the effect was devastating. The Zephyrni satellites had shields designed to withstand conventional attacks, but Cole's modified weapons tore through them like they were not even there. Within minutes, the colony's orbital defenses were in ruins. Governor Keshmer of Zephyr 7 could not believe what was happening. His colony had existed peacefully for over 200 years and had never faced military action of any kind. Now primitive humans were attacking from orbit and his defenses were failing. He sent emergency transmissions to every Zephyrni ship in range, but help would not arrive in time to prevent catastrophic damage. Colonel Sarah Mitchell led the ground assault force that launched from Hansen's fleet in specially modified transport shuttles. Her mission was surgical and specific. The colony's primary communications hub was located in the capital city, and destroying it would cut off Zephyr 7's ability to coordinate with the rest of the M. Pair. Her team of 300 soldiers was outnumbered by the colony's security forces, but they had the advantage of surprise and superior training. The shuttles landed on the outskirts of the city, and Mitchell's troops moved quickly toward their objective. Zephyrni security forces tried to organize a defense, but they were not soldiers. They were police trained to handle civilian disturbances, not military assaults. The human troops cut through them with ruthless efficiency and reached the communications hub in under an hour. Mitchell planted demolition charges throughout the facility while her troops held the perimeter against increasingly desperate Zephyrni counterattacks. The charges were set with precision to ensure complete destruction of the equipment while minimizing civilian casualties. When everything was ready, Mitchell gave the order to evacuate, and her teams pulled back to the extraction point. The explosion that destroyed the communications hub could be seen from orbit. Hansen watched the flash of light and knew that Mitchell had succeeded. Now came the difficult part. The Zephyrni fleet would be responding, and his ships needed to withdraw before they arrived. But he had one more objective to complete before leaving. Commander Susan Blake had identified several intelligence targets in the colony's computer networks. If her team could access those systems, they might gather valuable information about Zephyrni military capabilities and strategic plans. She led a small group of specialists who infiltrated the colony's data center while the communications hub assault was drawing attention. Blake's team bypassed Zephyrni security protocols with surprising ease. The aliens had never needed to defend against cyber intrusion, because none of their previous enemies had possessed the technical knowledge to attempt it. Within 30 minutes, Blake had copied terabytes of data, including fleet compositions, ship specifications, and strategic deployment plans. The intelligence windfall was beyond anything they had hoped for. The strike fleet began its withdrawal. As Zephyrni warships started arriving in the system, 3 enemy cruisers moved to intercept Hansen's ships, but they were too late to prevent the escape. The human fleet jumped to hyperspace with minimal losses and left Zephyr the 7th in chaos behind them. The entire operation from arrival to departure had taken less than 4 hours. Governor Keshmer surveyed the damage to his colony and felt shock turning to anger. The humans had struck with precision and withdrawn before his forces could mount an effective response. The communications hub was destroyed and would take months to rebuild. Dozens of defense platforms were wrecked. Worst of all, the psychological impact on his people was severe. The Zephyrni had always believed they were safe within their own territory, and now that illusion was shattered. Vexler received news of the attack on Zephyr 7. While still maintaining his blockade of Earth, he stared at the report in disbelief. The humans had not only held out against his fleet, but had launched their counterattack deep inside Zephrani space. They had struck a civilian colony and withdrawn before reinforcements could arrive. The audacity was staggering, but so was the strategic brilliance. The commander immediately understood the implications. If humans could strike at Zephyra the Seventh, then no colony in the Empire was truly safe. The Zephrani would need to divert military resources to defend their own territory instead of concentrating them against Earth. The war had just become far more complicated and expensive than anyone in the High Command had anticipated. On Zephyr Prime, the news of the attack caused an uproar in the council chambers. Elder Kirishan stood before her fellow council members, and her expression was grim. She reminded them that she had warned against this war from the beginning. The ancient warning about humans had been clear, and they had chosen to ignore it. Now they were learning the cost of that arrogance. The council debated their options, and the discussion was heated. Some members demanded that the Empire commit its full military might to crushing humanity once and for all. Others argued that the cost of such a campaign would leave them vulnerable to threats from other directions. The Empire had many enemies, and if word spread that humans could strike Zephrani colonies with impunity, then others might be emboldened to try. Back on Earth, Captain Hansen and his fleet received a hero's welcome despite their battered condition. President Callahan personally greeted the returning crews and thanked them for their service. The mission had succeeded beyond all expectations, and the intelligence gathered by Blake's team was already being analyzed by military strategists. Admiral Hayes reviewed the data and realized they now had detailed information about Zephrani fleet movements and defensive positions. More importantly, they had proven that humanity could strike back. The Zephrani were no longer the unchallenged aggressors. They were vulnerable, and they knew it. The war was far from over, but the balance had shifted. Humanity had shown that they would not simply defend their own territory, but would carry the fight to the enemy. Every Zephrani colony and supply base now had to consider the possibility of human attack. The Empire's resources would be stretched thin trying to protect everything while also maintaining offensive operations against Earth. Vexler sat in his command chair and contemplated his situation. His fleet was damaged, and his enemy had just demonstrated capabilities he had not anticipated. Reinforcements were coming, but so were questions from the High Command about how he had allowed this situation to develop. The ancient warning that he had dismissed so casually now seemed prophetic. The humans were not like other species the Empire had conquered, and continuing this war might cost more than victory was worth. The war continued for 3 more months, and every day brought fresh horror to both sides. The Zephrani sent reinforcements, but they arrived piecemeal and were met by human forces that had grown stronger through captured technology and hard-won experience. Every battle taught humanity new lessons, and they adapted faster than the Empire could adjust their tactics. The cost in lives was staggering, but neither side showed any sign of backing down. Captain Hansen led raid after raid against Zephrani supply lines and support bases. His fleet had grown from the original strike force as more ships were built using a combination of human engineering and reverse-engineered alien technology. The new vessels were still inferior to pure Zephrani designs, but they were good enough to fight, and that was all that mattered. Hansen's crews developed a reputation among the enemy for appearing where they were least expected and disappearing before reinforcements could trap them. Lieutenant Commander Chris Bennett specialized in intelligence operations, and his team had become experts at infiltrating Zephrani computer systems. Every raid yielded more data, and every piece of data revealed more weaknesses in the Empire's defenses. Bennett led a daring mission to board a Zephrani research vessel that was studying human tactics. His team captured the ship's entire database and escaped before the security forces even realized they had been boarded. The intelligence Bennett recovered included detailed specifications for advanced Zephrani weapons and shield systems. Dr. Cole and his team at Luna Station worked frantically to understand and replicate the technology. They could not match the quality of Zephyrni manufacturing, but they found ways to adapt the designs to human production capabilities. Within weeks, human ships were being retrofitted with improved shields and more powerful weapons. Vexter watched his advantage erode day by day. The technological superiority that the Empire had always relied upon was disappearing as humans stole and copied everything they could get their hands on. Worse still, the humans were innovating in ways that Zephyrni doctrine never anticipated. They used asteroids as mobile bases. They rigged abandoned stations with explosives and lured Zephyrni ships into traps. They broadcast false distress signals and ambushed rescue vessels. The psychological toll on Zephyrni forces was becoming severe. Soldiers who had expected an easy conquest were instead fighting an enemy that seemed to have no concept of fair play or honorable combat. Every engagement carried the risk of ambush or sabotage. Every victory came at a cost that made celebration impossible. Morale throughout the Zephyrni fleet was at its lowest point in recorded history. Admiral Hayes coordinated her forces with a precision born from desperation. She knew that humanity was still outnumbered and that one major defeat could unravel all their gains. But she also knew that the enemy was exhausted and demoralized. Intelligence reports suggested that debates were raging in the Zephyrni High Command about whether to continue the war or negotiate some form of settlement. The turning point came during a battle near Jupiter's orbit. Vexter had assembled his largest remaining fleet and was preparing for what he hoped would be a decisive assault on Earth's main defensive line. Hansen's reinforced strike fleet met them head-on, and the resulting battle was the most intense of the entire war. Ships on both sides fought with desperate fury, and the space around Jupiter became a graveyard of wreckage and debris. Pilot Officer Karen White was assigned to a fighter squadron that was tasked with harassing the Zephyrni capital ships. Her squadron had already lost half its members when she noticed an opportunity. Vexter's flagship had extended its shields to protect a damaged cruiser, and the shield gap left a narrow opening near the main reactor section. White did not hesitate or call for permission. She simply pointed her fighter at that gap and accelerated to maximum speed. The Zephyrni point defense systems opened fire, but White flew through the incoming barrage with skill that bordered on supernatural. Her fighter took multiple hits but kept flying. She reached the gap in the shields and flew her damaged craft directly into the flagship's reactor housing. The explosion that followed was massive and catastrophic. Vexter's flagship broke apart, and the command staff was killed instantly, including the commander himself. The death of Vexter threw the Zephyrni fleet into chaos. His second-in-command tried to assume control, but the communication systems were disrupted, and the formation discipline collapsed. Human forces pressed their advantage, and the battle turned into a rout. The surviving Zephyrni ships retreated in disorder, and many were destroyed or captured as they tried to escape. Admiral Hayes ordered her forces to pursue, but not to massacre. She wanted prisoners, and she wanted the Zephyrni to understand that humans could show mercy even in victory. Several damaged Zephyrni ships were allowed to withdraw after surrendering their weapons and databases. Others were boarded and their crews taken into custody. Among the prisoners was Sub-Commander Velkoth, who had been Vexler's tactical officer and closest advisor. Velkoth was brought to Earth and held in a detention facility that was comfortable by prison standards but still clearly a cage. Admiral Hayes visited him personally, and the conversation that followed would later be recorded and distributed throughout the galaxy. The Zephyrni officer was bitter and confused. He could not understand how his superior fleet had been defeated by what should have been an inferior enemy. Hayes explained it to him with brutal honesty. The Zephyrni had fought to conquer while humans had fought to survive. The Zephyrni had followed doctrine and expected their enemies to do the same. Humans had thrown out every rule and fought with pure desperation. The Zephyrni valued their lives and retreated when losses became unacceptable. Humans valued their freedom more than their lives and would rather die than surrender. Velkoth asked the question that had haunted every Zephyrni who had fought in this war. Why did humans fight so hard when accepting Zephyrni rule would have allowed them to live in peace? Hayes' response was simple and devastating. Peace without freedom was not peace at all. Living as slaves was not living. Every human understood this instinctively, and no amount of military force could change that fundamental truth. The conversation was interrupted by news that shocked both of them. The Zephyrni High Command had transmitted a formal request for negotiations. They were prepared to discuss terms for ending the war and establishing a permanent peace. The empire that had never retreated was asking for terms. Elder Kirishan herself was coming to Earth as the head of the diplomatic delegation. President Callahan received the news with cautious optimism. He convened his advisors and they debated how to approach the negotiations. Some argued for demanding harsh terms and forcing the Zephyrni to pay for every life lost. Others urged restraint and pointed out that humanity still could not defeat the entire empire if they chose to fully commit their resources. The debate continued until Admiral Hayes made a simple observation. The goal had never been to defeat the Zephyrni Empire, but to prove that conquering Earth would cost more than it was worth. That goal had been achieved. Now the task was to secure a peace that would protect humanity and establish them as equals rather than subjects. Demanding too much might provoke the Empire into continuing the war out of pride. Demanding too little might invite future aggression. The balance had to be perfect. Elder Kirishan arrived on Earth with a delegation of council members and military advisors. She was old even by Zephyrni standards, and her eyes held a sadness that spoke of wisdom gained through terrible cost. Her first meeting with President Callahan was formal and tense. Both sides acknowledged the losses they had suffered and the need to find a path forward. The negotiations took weeks and covered every aspect of future relations between humanity and the Zephyrni Empire. The final treaty established a demilitarized zone around human space that neither side would violate. Trade agreements were drafted that would benefit both civilizations. Prisoner exchanges were arranged and plans were made for joint scientific endeavors. Most importantly, the Zephyrni formally recognized humanity as an independent and sovereign species. Velkoth was released. As part of the prisoner exchange and returned to Zephyra Prime. Before he left Earth, he requested one final conversation. With Admiral Hayes, he told her that he would be writing a full report about the war for the military archives. He wanted to ensure that future generations of Zephyrni understood what had happened here and why. Hayes thanked him and suggested that he emphasize one point above all others. Never underestimate an enemy that has nothing left to lose. The treaty was signed in a ceremony that was broadcast across both human and Zephyrni space. President Callahan and Elder Kirishan stood together and affirmed their commitment to peace. The celebration on Earth was tempered by grief for all who had died, but there was also hope for the future. Humanity had proven itself capable of standing against a galactic empire and surviving. Elder Kirishan requested a private meeting with President Callahan after the ceremony. She told him something that few outside the Zephyrni leadership knew. The ancient warning about humans had been written by Elder Keshver after he observed human tribes fighting each other over resources and territory. He had been struck by their absolute refusal to surrender even when defeat was certain. He had witnessed humans fighting to the death over small patches of land and had extrapolated what they might be capable of if they ever developed advanced technology. The old Zephyrni elder explained that Keshver had written in his personal journals that humans possessed something the Empire had lost over millennia of easy conquests. They possessed the willingness to sacrifice everything for what they believed in. That quality made them dangerous beyond any weapon or technology. Kirishan had read those journals as a young scholar and had never forgotten the warning. She had tried to prevent this war, but her voice had been ignored. Now thousands were dead on both sides because pride and arrogance had overruled. Wisdom. Captain Hansen received a promotion to admiral and was given command of the new border defense fleet. His mission was to ensure that the treaty was honored and to watch for any signs of renewed aggression. He accepted the responsibility knowing that eternal vigilance would be the price of the peace they had won. Lieutenant Amy Rogers became his chief of staff, and together, they began building a defensive network that would protect human space for generations. The Zephyrini military archives were updated with detailed accounts of the war. The entry about humans was expanded to include tactical analyses and strategic recommendations. At the bottom of the file, a simple statement was added by order of the High Command. The elders left one saying about humans, and that saying was stay away from them. Commander Vexler ignored this warning and led 30 ships to Earth. 15 ships were destroyed, and Vexler died in battle. The Empire learned that warnings exist for reasons, and ignoring them carries a price. Measured in blood and failure, throughout the galaxy the story of Earth's war with the Zephyrini spread quickly. Other species heard about the humans who had fought an empire to a standstill and forced it to negotiate peace. Some saw humanity as potential allies, while others marked them as enemies to be avoided. But all of them learned the same lesson. Never judge a species by their technology alone. The strongest weapon any civilization possesses is the will to use whatever tools they have in defense of their freedom. On Earth, life slowly returned to normal, though nothing would ever be quite the same. Memorials were built to honor the fallen, and their names were recorded for posterity. Children grew up hearing stories about the war and the heroes who had fought it. The orbital stations were rebuilt, and the colonies were reinforced. Humanity looked to the stars not with fear, but with confidence born from hard experience. They had faced the worst the galaxy could throw at them, and they had survived. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way they had faced every challenge throughout their history. Together and unbroken and absolutely free.